Hello, and welcome to the Daily Bible Podcast with Trisha and Michelle. We're just two friends reading through the Bible chronologically and encouraging you to do the same. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook, Daily Bible Podcast, or go to our website, dailybiblepodcast.net. We are going through the 1-year chronological Bible, and we have links for that in our show notes and also at our website.
And if you're on Facebook, be sure to check out our community group, which is Daily Bible Podcast, and leave us a review if you have a chance on wherever you listen to us. You go on Apple
Mm-hmm.
Podcasts or any of the podcast app, leave us a review. I texted Michelle one the other day. Someone left a review, and I'm like, look at Michelle. They said
I
such
know, it's
kind
so
things about
cool.
us. So it really is encouraging to us, and then also helps other people like, oh, okay, maybe this is something I want to listen to also.
Mm-hmm. And we hope so. We It's not that we want more listeners, we want more listeners, but we want to continue to expand what we feel
Hmm.
God is doing, and that is while
Yeah.
we're reading in community, we're learning in community, and so if we could just continue to share more and more about what we're learning with others, that's what we wanna do.
Yeah.
So, yes, please go and rate us and leave a comment, we'd appreciate that. Okay, so today we are reading 2 Samuel 8, verses 15 through 18. Then we're going over to First Chronicles 18, verses 14 through 17. And then we're backing up just a couple of chapters to First Chronicles 6, verses 16 through 30. Then we're going to jump over to First Chronicles 6, verses 50 through 53. Then we're going to back up and fill in that gap at First Chronicles 6, verses 31 through 48. Then go back to Second Samuel and read chapters 9 and 10, and then finish out the day with First Chronicles 19.
All
It was a
right.
lot, but it all
It
made
was a lot.
sense in the end.
I love just reading it. It just ties everything together so neatly.
It
Instead of like,
does.
what was this? When was this happening? It figures it out for you, so you know exactly when things are happening. I love it. So today's reading starts on a high note. Second Samuel 8:15
Yay.
says, yeah, I know. I love the high note parts. So David reigned over all Israel and did what was just and right for all his people. And David's sons served as priestly leaders. And I'm not sure if I've ever read that before. It like I
I don't
paused and
think
I'm
I did
like,
either.
what? His sons were priestly leaders?
I
Like
know.
what? Like, really? I don't remember. I literally don't remember that before. But okay, then we once again get into a list of genealogy, and as we're reading, lots of names are popping out. So we've been walking with these people for a while. We read the list of Levites, so the descendants of Aaron, and the names of those who led the music in the house of the Lord after the ark was placed there. And it says they ministered with music at the tabernacle until Solomon built the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. Then we went back to 2 Samuel 9 and we returned to the narrative of David's story. And it starts with David asking this question: is anyone in Saul's family still alive? Anyone to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Then it sums
Mhm.
up Saul's servant Ziba, who tells him that one of Jonathan's sons is alive, and that's Mephibosheth, but he is a cripple. Now, this could have been a scary situation because remember, kings would often wipe out the descendants of previous kings because those
Mhm.
descendants were often seen as threats. So even for Ziba to mention that this guy is alive, Mephibosheth, that could have been problems. But instead, David said, "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." And so David's like, Mephibosheth, don't worry. I gotcha. I'm gonna take care of you.
That's such an amazing promise. I mean, to really think through that. I mean, he had to have known that he and this king, David, his father and David were friends, but to really think through that and go, "He's got my back." Like, really?
Mhm.
He's got my back. I'm a crippled and everything, and yet he's got my back. That's
Yeah,
pretty
and
cool.
especially at a time where they would just wipe out. They would just
Mhm.
wipe out all the descendants of remember, one of Gideon's sons went and killed all his brothers because
Mhm.
he wanted to be the ruler. I mean, it was sometimes in their own families and definitely in the family of the previous ruler. I mean, those so this is like grace upon grace. Like, not
Mhm.
only am I going to keep you alive, I'm going to let you sit at my table and take care of you, which is so cool. Just again shows David's heart. And then David set it up so Ziba's son, which is the servant of Saul who took care of or helped Mephibosheth, and servants were to farm the land. That David was returning to produce food for Mephibosheth's household. So Mephibosheth was eating at the king's table, but then also these servants that used to be Saul's servants were not. They were also not killed, and then they are producing food from the land that belonged to Saul to care for Mephibosheth's family. So it's really cool. So then we moved to 2 Samuel 10 and we learned about how big events can arise from taking the wrong advice. And 2 Samuel tells the story of David's kindness toward Hanun, the king of Ammon, after his father died and how it was misunderstood. And it led to a war between Israel and Ammon. David sent messengers to express the condolences to Hanun after the death of his father, and the advisors convinced him that the messengers were spies. And so they
Mm.
humiliated them. That's when they cut like half of their beard and cut their robes so their buttocks were showing. That, I mean, that was humiliating. And
That
so then
was humiliating.
it's like grown men to do that to them, and then like go on
Mhm.
your way. And so then he sent them back, and David was angered by this, and he gathered his army to attack Ammon, and the Ammonites hired the Armenians to help. So the Israelites were fighting on two fronts, the Ammonites on one side and the Armenians on the other. But instead of getting discouraged, Joab, their leader, looked to God. And I love this. It says Joab saw that there were battle lines in front of him and behind him. So he selected some of his best troops in Israel and deployed them against the Armenians. He put the rest of the men under the command of Abishai, his brother, and deployed them against the Ammonites. And Joab said, "If the Armenians are too strong for me, then you are to come to my rescue. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come to rescue you. Be strong and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight." And that just
Mm.
encouraged me to see that this Joab, this leader, this commander of this army is depending on God. It reminded me of like again Joshua, like the Lord will fight for you, or you know,
Mhm.
just all those promises. Like again, this commander is leaning on God. And then remember Psalm 60 from yesterday. This psalm is David crying out to God during these events. And he said, "Save us and help us with your right hand, that those you love may be delivered. Give us aid against the enemy, for help. For human help is worthless. With God, we will gain the victory and he will trample down our enemies." So as they're out there fighting, David from yesterday, we had the reading right at the end, that he was crying out to God also. So with God, we will gain the victory and he will trample down our enemies. So even though they're battling, this still is a high note because they are seeking
Mhm.
God in the middle of these battles.
Well, and I love that you brought in Joab in this and just his words of be strong and let us fight bravely for our people in the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight. It just reminds me
Mhm.
of Joshua, but
Mhm.
also I just can't help but think Joab was one of the mighty men. He was one of the men that was first to come and be with David in the cave of Adullam. And and continue to build this force behind David. How many years ago when Saul was after David?
Right.
And Joab is still with him, and I can't help but think that as David's leading these men, he's also gotta be, I don't know if you would say leading devotions, but they're learning from
Spiritually,
him.
yes, spiritually a spiritual
Yeah.
leader, not just a physical leader.
Right, and they're learning from him, they're learning just who God is because David had this faith in him, and also Joab's from the family of David, so you know that there had to have been
Mhm.
probably something that they learned when they were young, and it's just something that continues to bubble up continually, spring up a well is where my mind went. It's
I
something
love
that
it.
just continues to flow out of them is this extreme trust in God, but I want to talk a little bit about the temple musicians because, now that we have gone through many years of the Israelites and and where they were supposed to be. We've come from Judges. We were in Joshua where they, went in and they got the land. And then we went through all those years of the Judges, and now we're out of the Judges. And so all of the sudden, we're talking about these temple musicians. And is this the first time since Joshua? I'm just curious. I can't remember if it's the first time. But even if it's not the first time since Joshua, we know that there was many years in there that there was not temple musicians and there
I
was
mean,
not.
I think this is all that I remember, although I did research just because I'm writing a novel on Hannah,
Mhm.
and I think Elkanah was part of, like, the temple, working in the temple,
Okay.
or they were part of the musicians or musical family. Just that's from my side note novel
Uh-huh.
research right now. But
Yeah.
so it was happening. There was continued musicians, but this, I think, and correct us in the group if you know
Yes,
differently.
please do. That's
This
that's
seems
why we're asking.
this seems up to me, like, this seems like you were saying that this is the first time it's really brought up again.
Yeah, and I just love how David is putting these things back. Like, he's being very intentional. He's not just going and conquering the land and conquering the enemies and building what he wants to build in his palace or, his house. He is building back the spirituality in this land, and he's pulling it back by one of these things is this temple musicians. I just feel like he's being a true king. He's
Mhm,
leading the
mhm,
people back to a right relationship with God. God didn't just establish him to rule and reign. God established him to rule and reign and be a man of God, and to that would sort of do a ripple effect throughout the community. That
mhm,
David would put God back on the throne, and that's what we're seeing. But I just want to talk about this musician Heman. This man is mentioned several times in connection with temple worship. So at the beginning of our discussion today, when David is assigning the following men to lead the music in the house of the Lord, he mentions Heman is the musician from the clan of Kohath. And this man is mentioned in connection with temple worship in the days of David and Solomon. And we'll read more about him later on when we get to First Chronicles 15, 16, 25, and also further on into Second Chronicles 5. But he was an important part of the ceremonies connecting with bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and the dedication
mm.
of the temple. And just he caught my eye when I was reading. So that's why I was like, I want to find
I
out more
It's so
about
funny
him.
because 'cause I'm like, I don't even remember this guy, so I'm so glad you brought this up, Michelle. This is awesome.
Because I was just like, there's gotta be something. He was one of the first men who was named in here, and I was like, there's gotta be some reason. Well, it goes
Mm,
on to Psalm 88 is actually attributed to Heman. It's a song, it's a psalm of the sons of Korah to the chief musician, and it's to Heman, the Israelite or Ezrahite. And it shows a man who is well acquainted with sorrow and trouble because in verse 3 of Psalm 88, it says, "For my soul is full of troubles. I am like a man who has no strength." And it goes on into verse 7 says, "Your wrath lies upon me." And we just see some of these sweetest songs come from the heaviest
mm,
sorrow, and it makes me want to just, I don't know, crack open a window and see who this man is. And what
mhm,
did David know? David obviously had to have known if he is putting this guy forward in the temple of
mhm,
music or in for the music of the temple, he had to have known who this guy was. He had to have been a man strong of character. And I love as we're reading and as we're gathering and as we're talking amongst ourselves in community and as we're learning more about these people, I'm just like j- g- uh, David surrounded himself with some pretty incredible men and women, surrounded
mhm,
himself with men and women who were going to point him to God and who were not just going to point him to God, but point the rest of the people to God. And I just love as we're learning more and more, we're learning about a man who was so intent on glorifying God. and glorifying this Lord of Lords. And he surrounded himself with people who would do that too.
Yeah,
So,
because we talked about Joab, and then now we have this Heman guy. I mean, it shows the character. Your friends, who your friends are, who you surround yourself with, do show your character a lot. And I love that you brought this out because my eyes skimmed over that name. I wasn't looking at that at all. The word of the day is summoned. It means to
Mm,
call people to attend, such as a meeting, or to authoritatively, urgently call on someone to be present. So we see different people being summoned here. First, David shows kindness to Mephibosheth. Despite potential threats on both sides, like there's armies and all this stuff happening, David still restores this family land, Saul's family land, and allows Mephibosheth to eat at the king's table. David's son could have made a claim for the throne because that's what they did back
mm,
then.
yeah.
And David could have killed Mephibosheth to make sure this didn't happen. Instead, David issued kindness. He said, again, don't be afraid. I want you to eat at my table. And this is a picture of the loyalty and friendship that
Mhm,
extended beyond death and bloodline. Again, you mentioned this is Jonathan's son. And so that loyalty and that friendship with this relationship of Mephibosheth's father continues here, and David's leadership is marked by a willingness to serve and care for his people. And yet, then again, his kind acts aren't always appreciated because then we have King Hanun who accepted the wrong advice. And so, even David's act of kindness, he sent people to give condolences for this death, and it was misinterpreted. So, sometimes it leads to the wrong consequences. Yet, Joab's leadership in the face of adversity again is inspiration. And then you brought up this other person, the temple worshiper guy, Heman. Like there's positives and negatives to
mhm,
David's kind, and most of the time it goes well. But sometimes, like with that one
mhm,
king, foreign king, it did not go well. But in 2 Samuel 10:17 through 18, when David heard was happening with the fighting that was going on with King Hanun, he mobilized all Israel. They crossed the Jordan River and led the army to Halem, and the Armenians positioned themselves in a battle formation. And I thought this was so interesting when it gets to the numbers. It said the Armenians fled from the Israelites. That time, David's forces killed 700 charioteers and 40,000 foot soldiers, including Shobach, the commander of their army. And this showed that no matter how many the enemy were summoned, because it talked about they summoned all these enemies to come and help them, um, they still lost because God was on the side of David. So we can be summoned or called just like Mephibosheth was. You could be summoned or called just like the Armenians were called to come help fight the battle. And it can lead to blessing, it can lead to death. 40,000 soldiers were killed and 700 charioteers. They were summoned to help and
mm.
they did not help. They ended up getting killed. So, I mean, it just made me think of who are we allowing to summon us, and is it for blessing, is it for cursing? God's side will always win. And it just made me think of our life, like who are we listening to, who are we allowing to have authority in our lives? And you may think like, okay, this doesn't apply to us today, but if we're watching certain media, if we're
Mhm.
getting our advice from other people, we are giving them authority in our lives. We are being present, we are showing up, we are giving our support. If we're supporting certain movies or shows or books or people, we are being summoned by them. And who are we going to pick? It just made me think of you never know who you're following, but make sure it's on God's side.
Just as you're talking about summoning, and it can be so little or it could be so big. I remember being summoned for a meeting, an all staff meeting at a ministry that I was serving down in Arkansas. And that meeting changed the course of my life. I probably
Mm,
would still be in the South. I'd still be like, just 10 minutes from you,
my
Trisha.
neighbor.
And that meeting changed the course of my life when they said, "Hey, we're moving, our headquarters," and I had to go through the next year and a half trying to think through where is God taking me? Like,
Mhm.
where is God summoned me to go with them, or is God summon me in a different place? And he did summon me to a different place. I moved to Michigan to produce radio for another ministry, and then it seemed like God continued to summon me to different places, and now I'm with another radio ministry, and we've got this daily Bible podcast, and I just look back when
Mhm.
I read in the notes that you used the word summon. I was like, I feel like God's been summoning me with for the last, I think, 3 years and pulling
Mhm.
me in different places, and it's like, am I willing to go that next step? Am I willing to go where he is asking me? And that's really what we need to do when we feel God tugging on our heartstrings, and is we need to continue to march forward and again ask, is this where you have me, God? Is this where
And
you have
trusting
me?
God. Yeah, and trusting
Yes.
God because Mephibosheth, when he was summoned, he had to trust David's heart because he could have taken off and hid if he
Yeah.
didn't trust David's heart, because really David could have wiped him out.
Mhm.
That's could have been the purpose of being summoned. But instead, he trusted David's heart, probably because of his friendship with Mephibosheth's father, Jonathan, and he got to sit at the king's table. And so, what if he would have just rose up in fear and tried to figure out things his own way and gone and hid? First of all, that wouldn't have David would not have appreciated that, but he
No.
would have missed out on the blessing. And because you felt summoned, but you had to pause and you had to listen, you had to pray.
Mhm.
We had conversations about it, like, should I do this? And you were looking into different things, and but you felt like you could trust God. So even though it was completely out of your comfort zone, completely in a different location, God had a plan, and it does take us stilling ourselves and quieting our heart and saying, okay, God, I will trust you, just like Mephibosheth had to trust David.
Right.
Otherwise, we try to figure out things on our own, and that's when we get in trouble. So,
So
yeah.
in trouble.
Yeah.
Would you
Michelle,
pray for someone who is being summoned today that they
I will.
would listen?
Yeah. Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much that you do summon us, and that if we are still, and that if we quiet our mind and our heart, instead of trying to figure out our own plans, if we just open your word and be still before you, Lord, that you will lead us. And sometimes that leading is a phone call or a
Mhm.
conversation, or have you thought about this? Or, I was praying for you and God reminded me of this. Sometimes it is a verse in your word, but sometimes it is wise people that you put around us, Lord. But I pray that we will learn to listen. We will learn to be aware of your
Mhm.
leading. We will learn who to take advice from, how to lean into others also that you place in our lives, Lord. And I pray that we will be willing to take steps of faith to be summoned into the things that you called us to, that you have a feast prepared for us, just like Mephibosheth at David's table. You have a feast prepared, but we have to trust you. I pray today that as you are calling us out, Lord, that we will be discerning to follow your call and to also be courageous to step out in those areas. And we thank you and praise you for all the things that you have planned for us. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, we are sending you off with some daily encouragement to get into the Word and be the hands and feet of Jesus. Again, if you don't have the 1 year chronological Bible that we are using, we have links to that in our show notes. You can even find it in the Kindle format. Also, in the show notes is a monthly and yearly schedule of the Bible reading plan that we are following. So, tomorrow we are reading First Chronicles 20, verse 1, then move on to Second Samuel 11. 2 Samuel 12, verses 1 through 14. Then we will read Psalm 51, smack dab in the middle of
Hmm.
2 Samuel. And then we will read 2 Samuel 12. We will finish off that chapter and read verses 15 through 25. Then we will move over to 2 Samuel 5, verses 14 through 16. How the writer of the chronological Bible ever got all this straight, I do not
I'm
know.
amazed. I'm amazed. Yeah.
And then we're going to finish up tomorrow in First Chronicles first, First Chronicles 14 verses 3 through 7, and then First Chronicles 3 verses 5 through 9.
And we will see you here tomorrow.
Bye-bye.